Nobody talks about the meals that kept one-income families alive in 1965 when a single paycheck had to cover everything and grocery budgets were stretched to the breaking point. These dishes were not glamorous, but they held entire households together on pennies a serving. Here are 30 meals no one makes anymore. Salmon croquettes were a Friday night tradition in one-income households, stretching a single can of salmon into dinner for the whole family. The canned fish was drained, flaked, and mixed with crushed saltine crackers, diced onion, an egg, and black pepper. Patties were shaped by hand and fried in a cast-iron skillet until golden and crispy outside while staying moist and flaky inside. Mothers served them alongside white rice and canned peas, turning a 70-cent can into a complete meal for 6. Children loved the crunch and mild flavor that never felt like poverty food. The dish required no special skills, just patience at the stove and a steady hand for flipping. Salmon croquettes were dependable, affordable, and satisfying, the kind of practical cooking that kept families fed without complaint. Though they have mostly vanished from modern tables, their memory lingers for anyone who grew up smelling them sizzle on a weeknight. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a weeknight staple that turned dried beef and pantry basics into a filling supper. Thin slices of dried beef were torn into strips and simmered in a white sauce made from butter, flour, and milk, creating a salty, creamy gravy that clung to everything it touched. The mixture was ladled over thick slices of toasted bread, softening them just enough to soak up the sauce. A package of dried beef cost less than a quarter, and combined with milk and bread, the total came in under 50 cents for 5. Fathers who ate it during military service brought the recipe home, and mothers adapted it with a gentler hand on the salt. Children asked for seconds because the creamy texture felt more indulgent than it cost. It was quick, required no oven, and could stretch further with a hard-boiled egg sliced over top. Creamed chipped beef was honest food that bridged mess halls and family kitchens without pretension. Red beans and rice was a Monday tradition that fed entire families on a single dollar while the week's laundry boiled on the stove beside it. Dried kidney beans were soaked overnight, then simmered for hours with a ham bone saved from Sunday dinner, onions, celery, garlic, and bay leaves until creamy and thick. The ham bone gave up every last bit of flavor, transforming plain beans into a deeply satisfying stew. Served over steaming white rice, the combination provided complete protein that kept working fathers full through long afternoon shifts. Mothers started the pot early and let it cook unattended while handling housework, making it one of the most practical meals in any household. Leftovers improved overnight, stretching a single batch across 2 or 3 dinners. Children grew up associating Mondays with the smell of simmering beans and the warmth of a kitchen that promised something hearty. Red beans and rice was not just a meal, but a weekly rhythm that anchored families to both tradition and survival. Potato pancakes were a thrifty supper that transformed leftover mashed potatoes into something crispy and golden for pennies a plate. Yesterday's potatoes were mixed with a beaten egg, flour, diced onion, and salt, then shaped into rounds and fried in bacon drippings until crunchy and brown. The outside shattered with each bite, while the inside stayed soft and creamy, a texture contrast that made children forget they were eating recycled leftovers. Eastern European families brought this tradition to American kitchens, where it merged with the waste-nothing philosophy of one-income households. Mothers served them with applesauce or sour cream when the budget allowed, or simply ketchup when it did not. A batch for 6 could be made from potatoes costing 2 cents a pound. The smell of frying potatoes and onions filled small houses with warmth on cold evenings. Potato pancakes taught families that yesterday's dinner could become tonight's favorite, proving that resourcefulness was its own kind of kitchen magic. Ham hock and bean soup was a slow-simmered meal that stretched a single smoked ham hock into 3 days of hearty suppers. The hock was dropped into a large pot with soaked navy beans, diced onion, carrots, and celery, then covered with water and left to simmer most of the day. The smoky meat fell away from the bone while beans softened and broke down, thickening the broth into something creamy and rich without added flour or cream. Marrow from the bone melted into the liquid, giving the soup a body and depth that belied its humble cost. Families served it with cornbread baked in cast iron, using the bread to soak up every drop. A single ham hock cost 15 cents, and beans added only a few pennies more. Children ate bowlfuls without realizing they consumed a near-perfect balance of protein, fiber, and vitamins. Ham hock and bean soup was proof that patience and a good bone could feed a family better than any expensive cut of meat. Tomato bread soup was a desperation meal that turned stale bread and canned tomatoes into something warm and surprisingly comforting. Day-old bread was torn into chunks and dropped into simmering canned tomatoes with onion and a bit of sugar to cut the acidity, then cooked until the bread dissolved and thickened the liquid naturally. A spoonful of bacon grease stirred in at the end gave richness that plain tomatoes alone could never achieve. The cost was almost nothing since stale bread was free and a can of tomatoes ran about 10 cents. Italian and Portuguese immigrant families brought versions of this soup to America, where it found a natural home in kitchens stretched thin by single incomes. Mothers made it when the cupboard held little else, knowing even children who resisted vegetables would eat tomato soup with bread. The flavor was tangy and sweet, thick enough to coat a spoon, and warm enough to chase away drafty house chills. Tomato bread soup was humble food that carried dignity in its simplicity. Fried cornmeal mush was a breakfast-for-supper dish that gave families a hot, filling meal using nothing more than cornmeal, water, and a skillet of hot grease. The mush was cooked the night before by stirring cornmeal into boiling salted water until thick, then poured into a loaf pan and refrigerated until firm. The next evening, the solid block was sliced into rounds and fried in bacon drippings until golden and crunchy outside while staying soft and creamy inside. Drizzled with molasses or cane syrup, the slices became a supper children loved and adults found satisfying enough to last until morning. A 5-pound bag of cornmeal cost around 20 cents and could produce enough mush for a week. The dish required no eggs, no milk, and no meat, making it the cheapest hot dinner a mother could prepare. The contrast between crispy crust and tender interior created a simple pleasure needing no embellishment. Fried cornmeal mush was survival food that tasted like comfort, proving the plainest ingredients could deliver warmth. Navy bean soup with salt pork was a thick, stick-to-your-ribs meal that fed a family of 7 for less than a loaf of bread cost. Dried navy beans were soaked overnight, then simmered for hours with a chunk of salt pork, diced onion, and a bay leaf until the beans turned creamy and the broth became thick enough to hold a spoon upright. The salt pork rendered slowly, releasing smoky fat into the liquid and flavoring every bean without expensive seasonings. Mothers often mashed a portion of the beans against the pot's side to thicken the soup further, creating a velvety texture that made it feel richer than it was. Served with crackers or day-old bread, the soup provided protein, fiber, and calories to sustain a working man through a full day. A pound of dried beans cost 5 cents, and salt pork was among the cheapest cuts at the butcher. The soup kept well and improved with each reheating as flavors concentrated. Navy bean soup was dependable and honest, the kind of food that asked nothing and gave everything. Skillet cabbage and sausage was a one-pan supper that turned the cheapest vegetable in the store into a hearty meal seasoned by rendered pork fat. A head of cabbage costing 3 or 4 cents was sliced into thick wedges and laid into a cast-iron skillet alongside links of cheap smoked sausage. As the sausage cooked, its fat rendered out and soaked into the cabbage, softening it slowly while infusing every leaf with smoky richness. Sliced onions and a splash of vinegar added sweetness and tang that balanced the pork. The entire meal cooked in a single skillet over medium heat, requiring no oven and no extra pots. Mothers valued it because a small amount of meat stretched across enormous amounts of vegetables, feeding everyone for under 40 cents. The cabbage became tender and caramelized at the edges, while sausage turned crispy and deeply flavored. German and Eastern European families passed this down through generations. Skillet cabbage and sausage proved a humble vegetable, and a little pork could create genuine satisfaction. Egg gravy over biscuits was the meal mothers made when almost nothing remained in the kitchen except flour, eggs, and milk. The gravy started with bacon drippings melted in a skillet, then flour was whisked in to create a roux that cooked until pale gold. Milk was added slowly, stirring constantly until the mixture thickened into smooth, creamy sauce. Scrambled eggs were folded in at the end, breaking into soft curds that gave the gravy substance and protein. This peppery gravy was ladled over fresh biscuits made from flour, lard, and buttermilk, creating a supper that cost almost nothing. The biscuits soaked up the gravy like sponges, turning each bite into a savory mouthful that satisfied even the hungriest family members. In Appalachian and Southern kitchens, egg gravy appeared weekly, prepared without shame because it tasted too good to be called poverty food. Egg gravy over biscuits was love disguised as supper, stretching bare pantry staples into something that felt like abundance. Pinto beans and cornbread was the sacred combination that anchored working-class suppers across the South when a single paycheck had to stretch across every meal. Dried pintos were soaked overnight, then simmered all day with a ham hock or fatback, onion, and salt, until creamy and thick with a smoky, rich pot liquor. The cornbread was mixed from stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, and lard, then baked in a screaming hot cast-iron skillet that gave it a golden crust on the bottom. Families crumbled the bread directly into bowls of beans, letting it soak up the broth until every bite carried both starch and smoky flavor. A pound of dried pintos cost a nickel, and cornmeal was even cheaper, making this the most economical, complete meal a mother could serve. Children ate it without complaint because the flavor was genuinely comforting. Pinto beans and cornbread was more than a meal. It was the backbone of survival for families who understood that dignity lived in a well-seasoned pot. Chicken backs and rice was a weeknight supper built from the cheapest part of the bird, the bony back sections that butchers practically gave away. The backs were seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic powder, then simmered until the small pockets of dark meat turned tender and the bones released rich gelatin into the cooking liquid. That broth was used to cook white rice, infusing every grain with deep chicken flavor that made simple starch taste expensive. A package of chicken backs cost 10 or 15 cents, and combined with a cup of rice, the meal fed 5 for almost nothing. Mothers pulled whatever meat clung to the bones and mixed it into the rice, stretching each back as far as possible. Children gnawed the remaining bones clean, finding small bites in every crevice. The dish required patience more than skill, and the reward was supper that tasted rich despite humble origins. Chicken backs and rice proved that the least wanted parts could become the most satisfying meals on the table. Chipped potato skillet was the go-to supper when the icebox held nothing but potatoes and maybe half an onion. Potatoes were peeled and sliced thin, then layered into a cast-iron skillet with onion and fried slowly in bacon drippings until the edges crisped and centers turned soft and golden. Salt, pepper, and sometimes a shake of paprika were the only seasonings needed because the bacon fat carried enough flavor on its own. The potatoes stuck slightly to the skillet, creating a crispy bottom layer everyone fought over. Mothers often cracked eggs over the top near the end, letting them set in the steam for a complete one-pan meal. Potatoes cost 2 cents a pound, making this among the cheapest dinners possible. The entire family could eat for under 15 cents, and no one left hungry. The smell of frying potatoes and onions meant supper time in houses where simplicity was necessity, not choice. Chipped potato skillet was honest, filling food that never pretended to be more than it was. Vegetable soup from scraps was the meal that turned everything the garden offered and nothing the family could waste into a single nourishing pot. Carrot tops, celery leaves, potato peels, overripe tomatoes, and tough onion ends were saved throughout the week in a bowl in the icebox. On soup day, everything was chopped and simmered with a ham bone or beef marrow bone until the broth turned rich and vegetables softened into thick, hearty stew. Mothers added dried beans or noodles to stretch the pot further, ensuring it lasted through 2 suppers. The soup cost virtually nothing because every ingredient was already headed for the trash. Children never realized they were eating scraps because the long simmering transformed everything into something warm and deeply flavored. A single pot fed a family of 6 for 2 days, making it one of the most efficient meals in any household. Vegetable soup from scraps was the ultimate expression of the waste-nothing kitchen, proving that resourcefulness could taste like abundance. Fried bologna and potatoes was the kind of supper that showed up on Tuesday nights when payday was still 3 days away. Thick slices of bologna were scored around the edges to keep them flat, then fried in a hot skillet until the outsides crisped and the edges curled into salty, smoky cups. Alongside the meat, sliced potatoes were fried in the rendered bologna fat until golden and tender, soaking up every bit of flavor. The combination was simple, salty, and satisfying, delivering enough calories and protein to carry a working family through the evening. A pound of bologna cost about 20 cents, and potatoes added just pennies more. Mothers served it with white bread or leftover biscuits, and children ate without complaint because the crispy edges and smoky flavor were genuinely appealing. The dish required 1 skillet, 15 minutes, and almost no skill beyond knowing when to flip. Fried bologna and potatoes was not food anyone bragged about, but it kept families going when the budget had nothing left to give. Split pea soup with ham bone was the meal that gave a second life to Sunday's leftover ham, turning bare bones into a thick green soup that carried families through midweek. The ham bone, still clinging to bits of meat, was dropped into a pot with dried split peas, diced carrots, celery, and onion, then simmered for hours until the peas dissolved into a smooth, velvety soup. The ham flavor permeated every spoonful, making it taste far richer than its near-zero cost suggested. Split peas were among the cheapest legumes, costing just a few cents per pound, and combined with a bone destined for the garbage, this meal was practically free. Mothers ladled it into bowls with crackers or bread, and the thick consistency meant even small portions felt filling. Children who resisted green vegetables ate this without protest because the ham masked everything. Split pea soup with ham bone was thrift at its most delicious, transforming Sunday's leftovers into Wednesday's comfort. Macaroni and tomatoes was a pantry shelf supper that required nothing more than a box of elbow noodles, a can of tomatoes, and a bit of butter or bacon grease. The pasta was boiled until tender, then stirred with canned stewed tomatoes, a pinch of sugar to cut the acid, salt, and pepper. Some mothers added a slice of onion during cooking, while others stirred in a spoonful of bacon drippings for richness. The result was tangy, slightly sweet, and comforting. A one-pot meal that filled bellies without emptying pockets. A box of macaroni cost about 10 cents and a can of tomatoes the same, meaning the entire dinner came under a quarter for 5. The dish cooked in 15 minutes and required no special technique, making it the fastest hot supper a tired mother could produce. Children either loved the tangy sweetness or complained, but everyone ate because there was nothing else. Macaroni and tomatoes was not elegant, but it was reliable, cheap, and warm, the 3 qualities that mattered most on one income. Oxtail stew was a slow-cooked miracle that transformed one of the cheapest cuts at the butcher counter into a rich supper that tasted like it cost 10 times its price. Oxtails were seared in a heavy pot until browned, then simmered for hours with onions, carrots, potatoes, and garlic in enough water to cover. As the collagen broke down, the broth thickened naturally into a silky, gelatinous gravy that coated every vegetable and piece of meat. The meat became fall-off-the-bone tender, rich with a beefy depth that no other cheap cut could match. Oxtails cost just a few cents per pound because most shoppers passed them by for roasts and steaks. For one-income families, this was a hidden treasure at the meat counter. The stew improved with every reheating, stretching across several days. Children loved pulling the soft meat from the bones. Oxtail stew proved that the cuts nobody wanted could become the most satisfying meal on the table when given enough time and patience. Cornbread in buttermilk was a supper so simple it barely qualified as a recipe, yet it fed countless families when the kitchen held almost nothing else. Leftover cornbread was crumbled into a tall glass or bowl, then cold buttermilk was poured over it, until the bread softened into a tangy filling mixture eaten with a spoon. Some families added sliced green onions or a sprinkle of salt, but most ate it plain, letting the tang of buttermilk and sweetness of cornmeal carry the flavor. The meal cost virtually nothing since both ingredients were already in the kitchen, and it required zero cooking. Fathers ate it after late shifts when reheating a full meal seemed like too much effort. Children ate it on hot summer evenings when the kitchen was too warm for the stove. In Southern and Appalachian households, this was perfectly normal, a tradition passed from grandparents who understood that survival sometimes meant eating whatever was at hand. Cornbread and buttermilk was humility in a bowl, asking nothing and giving just enough. Liver and gravy over rice was a Tuesday night supper that delivered more nutrition per penny than almost anything else a mother could buy. Beef or pork liver was sliced thin, soaked in milk to temper the metallic flavor, then dredged in seasoned flour and fried quickly in a hot skillet with lard. The liver cooked fast, turning tender inside while the flour coating crisped into golden crust. Sliced onions were softened in the same pan, then flour and milk added to build a rich brown gravy that smothered everything. Served over white rice, the dish stretched a small amount of meat into a full family meal for under 30 cents. Liver was the cheapest protein at the counter, often less than 10 cents a pound, and packed iron and vitamins growing children desperately needed. The gravy softened the strong flavor enough that most kids ate without fuss. Liver and gravy over rice was practical nutrition disguised as comfort food, keeping families healthy when the budget left no room for anything fancier. Dandelion greens and fatback was a spring supper that came straight from the yard, costing nothing but the time it took to gather and cook. When the first warm days pushed dandelion leaves through the soil, mothers and children went out with baskets to pick young, tender greens before they turned bitter. The greens were washed several times, then simmered with a chunk of salt-cured fatback that rendered slowly and infused the liquid with smoky richness. Vinegar was splashed in near the end to brighten the flavor. The pot liquor left behind was almost as valued as the greens, sipped from cups or soaked up with cornbread. Fatback cost just a few cents and lasted through multiple pots. The dish provided vitamins and iron that families needed after months of stored and preserved foods. Children who complained about the bitterness ate anyway because spring greens meant strength. Dandelion greens and fatback was foraging turned into supper, proof that the land itself could feed a family. Dried apple stack cake was the dessert that appeared when a family had no money for sugar or fresh fruit, but still needed something sweet on the table. Thin layers of molasses-flavored cake dough were rolled out and baked one at a time, then stacked with a filling of dried apples cooked down into a thick, spiced paste. The cake sat for 2 or 3 days before serving, letting the apple moisture soften the dry layers into something tender and almost pudding-like. Families dried their own apples in autumn, stringing slices on thread and hanging them near the stove, ensuring fruit that lasted through winter. The molasses provided sweetness without expensive white sugar. Each layer was barely a 1/4 inch thick, but stacked 6 or 8 high. The cake became an impressive centerpiece. Children waited impatiently during the resting days, knowing the cake improved with time. Dried apple stack cake was patience made edible, a dessert rewarding families who planned ahead and wasted nothing. Salmon patties with cream sauce was a dressed-up version of the humble croquette, served when mothers wanted supper to feel special without spending extra. The patties were made the usual way, canned salmon mixed with crackers, egg, and onion, then fried golden in a skillet. But the cream sauce elevated them, a simple mixture of butter, flour, and milk, whisked until smooth and poured over the crispy patties. Sometimes canned peas were stirred into the sauce, adding color and stretching the meal further. The total cost stayed under $1 for 6, yet the presentation felt almost elegant compared to ordinary weeknight fare. Children who might have pushed plain croquettes around their plate ate willingly when covered in creamy sauce. The sauce softened the patties slightly, creating contrast between crispy edges and the tender sauced center. Salmon patties with cream sauce proved that a little extra effort could make cheap food feel like a real occasion. Fried salt pork and milk gravy was a breakfast for supper tradition that sustained families when the meat drawer held nothing but a slab of cured pork fat. The salt pork was sliced thin, soaked briefly to pull out excess brine, then fried slowly in cast iron until golden and crispy with edges that crackled between the teeth. The rendered fat became the base for milk gravy, thickened with flour and finished with whole milk until smooth and rich. Ladled over biscuits or bread, the gravy carried smoky salt into every bite. A pound of salt pork cost less than a dime and could produce enough gravy for the whole family. The dish was heavy and deeply savory, the kind of meal that made people drowsy but kept them full until morning. In Appalachian and rural southern households, fried salt pork appeared regularly because it required no refrigeration and no special ingredients. It was survival food that tasted like tradition, connecting families to generations who ate the same meal from the same skillets. Lentil soup with bread heels was a midweek supper that proved dried lentils were among the smartest purchases a mother could make on a tight budget. Unlike other dried beans, lentils needed no overnight soaking, going from bag to bowl in under an hour. They were simmered with diced carrots, onion, and celery in water, seasoned with salt, pepper, and a bay leaf, until they broke down into a thick, earthy soup. The bread heels that nobody wanted to eat as sandwiches were toasted and served alongside for dipping, soaking up the rich broth. A pound of lentils cost just 4 cents and produced enough soup to feed a large family twice. The soup was filling, rich in protein, and required no meat at all, making it ideal for the days when the budget simply could not stretch to the butcher counter. Children ate it because the thick texture and mild flavor were easy to enjoy. Lentil soup with bread heels was practical wisdom in a pot, feeding families well for almost nothing. Sausage gravy over toast was supper on the nights when biscuit dough seemed like too much work, but the family still needed something hot and filling. A few links of cheap breakfast sausage were crumbled into a skillet and browned until the fat rendered out and the meat crisped at the edges. Flour was sprinkled in and stirred until it absorbed the grease. Then milk was added slowly to build a thick, peppery gravy studded with bits of sausage. The gravy was ladled over thick slices of toasted bread that soaked up every drop. A pound of sausage cost about 20 cents, and bread and milk were pantry staples, bringing the total to under 40 cents for the whole family. The dish took less than 15 minutes from stove to table, making it one of the fastest hot suppers possible. Children loved the creamy, meaty gravy, and fathers found it filling enough after a long day. Sausage gravy over toast was a shortcut that sacrificed nothing in flavor or satisfaction. Bread pudding from stale loaves was the dessert that rescued day-old bread from the trash and turned it into something families actually looked forward to eating. Stale bread was torn into chunks, soaked in a mixture of milk, eggs, sugar, and vanilla until it softened into a custard-like mass, then baked in a greased pan until the top turned golden and the center set firm. Cinnamon and nutmeg added warmth, and raisins were stirred in when available. The cost was nearly nothing since stale bread was free, eggs came from backyard hens, and milk was a daily staple. The pudding emerged from the oven puffed and fragrant, its crispy top giving way to a soft, sweet interior that tasted far richer than its ingredients suggested. Mothers drizzled it with cane syrup or a simple sauce of butter and sugar. Bread pudding was served warm after supper, giving children a sweet ending to meals that were otherwise plain. It was thrift transformed into comfort, proving that even stale bread deserved a second life. Pepper and onion skillet with eggs was a supper that came together in minutes when the garden offered more peppers than the family could eat fresh. Bell peppers and onions were sliced and fried slowly in bacon drippings or lard until soft, sweet, and slightly caramelized. Eggs were cracked directly into the skillet on top of the vegetables and cooked until the whites set while the yolks stayed runny, creating a built-in sauce when broken with a fork. Served with bread for scooping, the meal was colorful, satisfying, and cost almost nothing when peppers came from the backyard garden. During summer months when gardens overflowed, this dish appeared several times a week without complaint. The sweetness of cooked peppers balanced the richness of the eggs and pork fat, creating a combination more flavorful than any single ingredient alone. Families ate it for breakfast, lunch, or supper, depending on when hunger struck. pepper and onion skillet with eggs was garden-to-table eating before that phrase existed. Buttermilk soup was a cold supper served on sweltering summer evenings when lighting the stove would have turned the kitchen into an oven. Cold buttermilk was poured into bowls, then leftover boiled potatoes were sliced or crumbled in, sometimes with chopped hard-boiled eggs, diced onion, and a heavy shake of salt and pepper. The tangy buttermilk acted as both broth and sauce, coating every piece with cool, sour richness. Scandinavian and German immigrant families brought versions of this soup to rural America, where it found a natural home in hot climate kitchens needing meals that required no cooking. A quart of buttermilk cost just a few cents, and the potatoes and eggs were already on hand. The soup was filling despite being cold, its protein and starch providing enough sustenance for a summer evening. Children found it refreshing on days when heavy food felt unbearable. Buttermilk soup was a clever answer to the problem of feeding a family without heating the house. Tomato gravy over rice was a southern supper that stretched a single can of tomatoes into a full meal by turning it into thick, savory gravy. Bacon drippings were heated in a skillet, flour whisked in to make a roux, and canned tomatoes added with their juice, stirred until the mixture thickened into a rich, tangy gravy. Sugar, salt, and pepper balanced the acidity, and the gravy was ladled over steaming white rice. The combination was tangy, comforting, and filling, satisfying a family of 5 for under 20 cents. Mothers made it when the pantry held nothing but rice and canned goods, knowing the gravy transformed plain rice into something children ate eagerly. The dish required 1 skillet and less than 20 minutes. Tomato gravy over rice appeared on tables across the rural South, wherever canned tomatoes and rice were staples. It was simple food done well, proving the barest kitchen could produce a meal worth sitting down for. The lard and salt sandwich is one of those meals that perfectly embodies the ingenuity and resilience of families during the Great Depression, when food was scarce and every penny had to stretch. It was as simple as it sounds, just bread, lard, and a generous sprinkle of salt. The lard, which was a cheap and readily available source of fat, provided the sandwich with richness and moisture, while the salt helped enhance the flavor, making it more palatable. While it may not have been fancy, the lard and salt sandwich was a practical and filling option when other food was out of reach. Bread was often the most affordable ingredient, and lard was something many households had on hand, especially those who lived on farms where pigs were raised for their meat. This sandwich wasn't about gourmet dining, it was about making do with what was available. Despite the lack of variety, it kept hunger at bay and provided some much-needed energy during a time when food options were limited. It was a meal that could be whipped up quickly and was surprisingly satisfying. Though it may seem unappealing today, the lard and salt sandwich was an essential part of survival for many families. It's a reminder of how people used their resourcefulness to make meals out of the most basic ingredients. And while lard and salt might have filled many bellies, the next sandwich on our list brings together a different combination of simple ingredients to create a surprisingly satisfying meal. Oatmeal water. Gravy on biscuits might sound strange today, but it kept a lot of folks going when meat and milk were scarce. Imagine a world where sausage gravy was off the table, too pricey, too hard to come by, and you still needed something hot and hearty to pour over your biscuits. That is where oatmeal water gravy stepped in. You cooked up a thin mixture of oats, flour, and water until it thickened, added a pinch of salt or bacon grease if you had it, and poured it over fresh or leftover biscuits. It was humble, filling, and as budget-friendly as a meal could get. You would find recipes for it scribbled in the margins of old Depression-era cookbooks or passed around farming communities where every scrap of food mattered. The gravy stretched breakfast, filled you up, and made dry biscuits a little easier to swallow. It was never about taste. It was about survival. Families leaned on this meal when meat was a memory, and flour, oats, and water were all they had left. Looking back, it was a reminder that pride takes a back seat when your stomach is empty. Peanut butter and honey sandwiches were an affordable and protein-rich lunch option that many children grew up eating. Combining creamy or chunky peanut butter with the natural sweetness of honey, this sandwich offered a quick and satisfying meal made from pantry staples. The ingredients were inexpensive and readily available, making this a go-to choice for families managing tight budgets. Peanut butter provided essential protein and fats, while honey added flavor and a touch of energy-boosting sugar. This sandwich was easy to prepare and transport, making it popular for school lunches or quick snacks. Its combination of sweet and savory flavors appealed to children and adults alike, becoming a timeless classic. Peanut butter and honey sandwiches symbolized resourcefulness and simplicity, reflecting how modest ingredients could come together to create comfort and sustenance. For many, this sandwich evokes memories of childhood and family care during financially challenging times. Cabbage and potato pancakes brought together two affordable staples into a crispy, filling dish that could feed a family on a shoestring budget. Shredded cabbage and grated potatoes were mixed with simple binders and fried until golden brown, creating savory cakes that were perfect for breakfast, lunch, or dinner. This recipe made the most of inexpensive ingredients by turning them into something satisfying and easy to prepare. The pancakes offered a delightful crunch on the outside and a soft, warm center, making each bite comforting and hearty. During the 1970s, when groceries were carefully budgeted, this dish was a favorite for stretching limited supplies without sacrificing flavor. It was often served with a dollop of sour cream or ketchup to add a little zing. The recipe also allowed for flexibility, with whatever spices or leftover vegetables handy mixed in. Cabbage and potato pancakes stood as a testament to the resourcefulness of families making every ingredient count. If you've never tried a raw onion sandwich, it's one of those meals that'll stick with you, for better or worse. Sliced raw onions, slathered with a bit of mustard or mayo, tucked between two slices of bread. It wasn't gourmet, but it was a working man's lunch that packed a punch. Onions were cheap, easy to store, and filled you up. The mustard or mayo added some tang and creaminess, but the star of the show was the onion. Not only was it a strong-flavored, inexpensive option, but it was also a great way to keep your hunger at bay until your next meal. Though its pungent scent often lingered long after the meal was finished, it didn't matter when food was scarce. For many families, raw onion sandwiches were a quick fix that provided the sustenance they needed to get through the day. But if you think this is as bold as it gets, just wait until you hear about the next sandwich. Cornmeal mush with syrup was a breakfast that could keep you going all day when the cupboard was looking pretty bare. It was simple, humble, and exactly the kind of meal that showed up in every old American cookbook during hard times. Cornmeal was cheap, shelf-stable, and filling, which made it perfect for families trying to stretch pennies as far as they could go. You just boiled the cornmeal with water or milk until it turned thick and soft like a porridge. Some folks fried it into slices once it cooled, but the fastest version was straight from the pot with syrup poured over the top. Molasses, sorghum, or whatever sweet syrup was available did the trick. It sounds plain, but this was survival food at its finest. It filled your belly and kept you from feeling hungry even when meat, eggs, and bread were out of reach. Parents fed it to their kids before school, farmers ate it before long days in the fields, and plenty of folks relied on it when paychecks dried up. Cornmeal mush with syrup was never glamorous, but it was dependable, and sometimes that was worth more than taste. Creamed spinach on toast was a popular frugal side dish that combined cooked spinach with a simple creamy sauce served over slices of toasted bread. This dish was affordable, using frozen or canned spinach mixed with milk or cream and thickened with flour or cornstarch to create a smooth, rich topping. The toasted bread provided texture and substance, turning a basic vegetable into a filling accompaniment suitable for any meal. Creamed spinach on toast was easy to prepare in large quantities, making it ideal for families seeking inexpensive ways to add nutrition and comfort to their dinners. It was often served alongside inexpensive proteins or eggs, reflecting the mid-century emphasis on hearty yet economical home cooking. This dish embodies the era's resourcefulness in stretching small amounts of vegetables to feed hungry households. Its creamy texture and mild flavor helped make spinach more appealing to children and adults alike. Today, it remains a nostalgic reminder of simple, satisfying meals from the past. Vegetable frittata with leftover veggies was a protein-packed casserole that rescued forgotten vegetables from the fridge, turning them into a hearty, affordable meal. Eggs, beaten and poured over diced carrots, peppers, onions, or greens, were baked until firm, creating a simple yet nourishing dish. This recipe was ideal for 1970s families who needed to make the most out of every grocery trip, using what was on hand rather than buying new ingredients. The frittata was filling enough to serve as a main dish and portable enough to be eaten cold for lunches or picnics. Its flexibility made it popular. Any combination of leftover vegetables could be tossed in without worrying about exact measurements. Baking the dish allowed the eggs to bind everything together, creating a warm, comforting meal that was easy on the wallet. Vegetable frittata highlighted the thrift and creativity of cooking during tough economic times while remaining delicious and satisfying. The apple and mayo sandwich might seem like a strange combination, but it was a surprisingly popular choice during tough times when ingredients were scarce and creativity in the kitchen was key. Sliced apples, typically tart varieties, were paired with creamy mayonnaise between slices of bread. The sweetness of the apples contrasted with the rich, tangy mayo, creating a unique and unexpected flavor profile. It wasn't the type of sandwich you would find in any deli, but it became a go-to option for those looking for something quick and different. The apples, which were relatively inexpensive and often readily available, provided a bit of freshness and texture, while the mayo added a comforting creaminess that tied the whole thing together. The apple and mayo sandwich was especially popular during times of rationing or when fresh produce was hard to come by, offering a rare chance to enjoy a sweet, crunchy bite. While it wasn't a culinary masterpiece, it was a meal that worked with what was available, perfect for those on tight budgets. The sandwich wasn't fancy, but it had an undeniable charm. For many, it was an odd but delicious treat that felt like a luxury in a world where simple ingredients were used to make the most of every meal. And if you thought the apple and mayo sandwich was unexpected, just wait until the next sandwich, where another quirky combination takes center stage with a surprising flavor twist. Bread and milk supper bowls were as plain as it gets, but they filled empty stomachs when there was not much else to eat. You sliced up old bread, stale, leftover, or whatever you had, and soaked it in milk, sometimes with sugar or a little syrup if you were lucky. That was it. It sounds pitiful today, but back then, this humble bowl of soggy bread was a familiar supper for kids, working folks, and anyone scraping by. You could find it written in old church cookbooks or jotted down on recipe cards passed between neighbors. The bread softened in the milk, turning into something like a sweet, simple pudding. In hard times, this was comfort food that came from next to nothing. It was quick, filling, and made the most of scraps that might otherwise get tossed out. Some families called it poor man's cereal, and it showed up at breakfast, lunch, or dinner depending on what was left in the pantry. It was never anyone's first choice, but when times got tough, bread and milk bowls made sure no one went to bed hungry. Vegetable fried rice was a quick and inexpensive meal that made use of leftover rice and seasonal or frozen vegetables. By stir-frying cold-cooked rice with onions, carrots, peas, and soy sauce, cooks could transform leftovers into a flavorful and filling dish. This meal was practical for families aiming to reduce waste and stretch limited food supplies. Vegetable fried rice was easy to prepare and customizable based on whatever ingredients were on hand, reflecting the adaptability needed in resource-conscious households. It also reflected influences from Asian cuisine that became increasingly familiar to Americans in the mid-20th century. This dish provided a balanced combination of carbohydrates and vegetables, making it a nutritious and satisfying option on a tight budget. Many remember vegetable fried rice as a tasty, no-fuss way to turn simple staples into a wholesome family meal. Creamed spinach on toast was a simple way to enjoy greens without splurging on fresh produce or fancy sides. Spinach was cooked down into a silky, creamy sauce made from basic pantry ingredients like milk, butter, and flour, then spooned generously over slices of toasted bread for a meal that was both comforting and frugal. In the 1970s, when fresh vegetables could be expensive or scarce, this dish provided a way to sneak in some nutrition without fuss or cost. The creamy texture disguised the humble nature of the spinach, making it more appealing to picky eaters or anyone craving warmth on a chilly night. Serving it on toast also added a satisfying crunch and helped stretch the meal further. It was a favorite for those seeking comfort food that did not require elaborate preparation or exotic ingredients. This dish brought a touch of elegance to an otherwise simple ingredient and reminded many of home-cooked meals filled with warmth and love, even on the tightest budgets. When the budget was tight and even jam or jelly was out of reach, butter and sugar sandwiches came to the rescue. It was as simple as it sounds: a thick layer of butter spread on white bread, then topped with a generous sprinkle of sugar. For many, this became the go-to treat, especially during the Depression. It was sweet, satisfying, and didn't require much in terms of ingredients. The butter added richness, and the sugar gave it a touch of sweetness, making it feel like a real dessert, even if it was just a way to fill the stomach when times were tough. The best part? It was incredibly cheap to make, and you didn't have to go hunting for expensive ingredients. Families would often have this as a snack or even as a light dessert to end the day. Despite how simple it seems, there's something comforting about its humble sweetness. But as simple as butter and sugar may be, it's about to get even simpler with the next sandwich on our list. Ketchup and butter spaghetti was a meal born out of pure necessity, and a little stubbornness to keep pasta night alive even when tomatoes and meat were out of reach. During lean years, especially the Depression and rationing days, pantry staples like spaghetti became the backbone of dinner. But traditional sauce? That was a luxury. Folks got creative. You boiled your pasta, tossed it with a pat of butter, and squeezed on some ketchup to make an instant tangy sauce. It was salty, sweet, and just enough to trick your brain into thinking you had a proper plate of spaghetti. Kids loved it because it tasted familiar, and parents leaned on it because it was cheap and filling. This recipe showed up in countless old cookbooks and handwritten family notes, a reminder of how folks stretched every meal when they had to. It might not win awards for authenticity, but ketchup and butter spaghetti was survival food that kept families fed, and sometimes it even showed up when money got better, just because people never forgot its place at the table. Meatless meatballs were a creative and thrifty alternative to traditional meatballs, made primarily from vegetables, breadcrumbs, and eggs. These meatless versions helped families reduce their reliance on expensive meat by using ingredients like grated carrots, zucchini, or beans, combined with seasonings and binders to create a satisfying texture. Once shaped into balls, they were baked or fried and served with sauces or pasta, mimicking the appearance and taste of meat-based dishes. Meatless meatballs were especially popular during periods of financial constraint or meat shortages, allowing households to enjoy familiar comfort foods on a budget. They also reflected growing interest in vegetarian options within economically limited kitchens. These dishes demonstrated how resourcefulness and adaptation helped preserve family traditions while managing limited resources. Many who grew up with meatless meatballs recall them fondly as inventive and filling meals that showed how to make every ingredient count. Sloppy lentil sliders were a clever way to enjoy the sloppy Joe craze on a budget, swapping ground beef for lentils simmered in tangy tomato sauce. These mini patties were packed with flavor and nutrients, but cost a fraction of traditional meat sliders, making them a popular choice for families tightening their belts. Lentils provided a meaty texture that held together well when formed into small slider-sized patties, which were then topped with the signature sloppy Joe sauce. Served on small buns or even plain bread, these sliders brought joy to dinner tables without denting wallets. This dish embodied the spirit of 1970s thriftiness, taking a beloved classic and making it accessible to all income levels. The warm, tangy sauce paired perfectly with the hearty lentils, satisfying appetites and stretching meals further. It was a great way to introduce plant-based proteins before such ideas became mainstream, showcasing the timeless nature of creative, budget-friendly cooking. Sometimes a quick and simple solution was needed when the month's budget was running low. Enter the cold hot dog slices and ketchup sandwich. This sandwich was made with leftover hot dogs, sliced cold, and slathered with ketchup between slices of bread. It wasn't fancy, but it was cheap, easy to make, and comforting. After payday, people might have splurged on hot dogs, but by the end of the week, those leftovers would be repurposed into this quick fix. The cold hot dog slices were nothing more than a vehicle for the ketchup, but when combined with bread, it made a satisfying snack or lunch. There wasn't much finesse to it, but it worked. It might not win any culinary awards, but when you've got limited resources, you make do with what you have. And while this sandwich may seem like an odd pairing, it's definitely one you'd want to try if you're in need of a last-minute meal. However, if you're craving something a little heartier, the next sandwich might just be what you're looking for. Potato cakes from leftover mash might not sound exciting, but they were a lifeline for families trying to stretch every bit of food they had. Leftover mashed potatoes never went to waste, and these fried patties were living proof. You mixed the cold mashed potatoes with flour or breadcrumbs, sometimes an egg if you were lucky, and fried them in a hot skillet until they were golden brown and crispy on the outside. It turned yesterday's leftovers into today's breakfast or dinner side. Potato cakes filled plates when grocery money ran low and the pantry looked empty. They popped up in all those frayed, oil-stained cookbooks because they made sense. They stretched food, cost nearly nothing, and fed everyone without complaint. You could dress them up with chopped onions, bits of herbs, or a dollop of sour cream if you had it, but most folks just ate them plain with salt and pepper. It might not be fancy, but these simple cakes brought a little warmth, crunch, and comfort to the dinner table when options were slim. If nothing else, they proved that waste was never an option back then. Bean and potato burritos were an economical and filling meal that made use of inexpensive, accessible ingredients. Simple tortillas were filled with a mixture of cooked beans and diced or mashed potatoes, sometimes seasoned with onions, garlic, or chili powder to add flavor. This dish was popular among families looking to stretch limited food supplies while providing enough calories and nutrients to satisfy hunger. Beans offered a valuable source of protein and fiber, while potatoes added bulk and energy, making the burrito a complete meal at a low cost. Easy to prepare and portable, bean and potato burritos were perfect for lunches or quick dinners. They also reflected the cultural blending occurring in many American kitchens during the mid-20th century. This humble dish demonstrated how creativity and thrift combined to feed families through tough economic times. Tomato soup with grilled cheese croutons took a beloved classic and added a budget-friendly twist by using small cubes of toasted cheese sandwiches as a crunchy topping. The smooth, tangy tomato soup was often made from canned tomatoes or tomato paste, simmered with simple seasonings like onions and garlic to keep costs low. Adding grilled cheese croutons brought texture and extra flavor without requiring expensive ingredients. This dish was a staple in 1970s homes, offering warmth and comfort during cooler months without stretching the food budget. The croutons were typically made from leftover sandwiches, reducing waste while enhancing the soup. Together, the creamy soup and crispy cheese bites created a satisfying contrast that felt indulgent even when made with humble components. Tomato soup with grilled cheese croutons was a perfect example of turning pantry basics into something more memorable, making it a cherished meal for families of all sizes. When it comes to using leftovers in the most creative way, the spaghetti sandwich is a prime example of resourcefulness. After a hearty meal of spaghetti, rather than letting any leftover noodles go to waste, many families would stuff the cold or reheated pasta between slices of bread, creating a sandwich that was both filling and practical. The beauty of the spaghetti sandwich lay in its simplicity. There was no need for additional ingredients, just pasta and sauce on bread, and that was enough to provide sustenance. Whether it was enjoyed cold or warmed up in a skillet, this sandwich made use of what was already prepared, turning leftovers into a whole new meal. It was a quick fix for lunch or dinner when funds were tight, and cooking from scratch wasn't an option. For many, the spaghetti sandwich wasn't just a meal, it was a way to stretch food further, especially during times of scarcity. The bread helped soak up the sauce, while the pasta provided a comforting, hearty filling. It wasn't a sandwich you'd see at a fancy restaurant, but it served its purpose well, turning a simple leftover dish into a satisfying, portable meal. It's the kind of meal that may sound odd to some, but to those who lived through hard times, it was a tasty and practical solution. When you needed to fill up and didn't have time or money for anything else, the spaghetti sandwich got the job done. And if you think spaghetti on bread is a simple fix, wait until you see what's next. Dandelion green salad with bacon drippings was the definition of making the most out of what nature handed you, and doing it with style. When grocery budgets dried up and gardens had not yet filled in, Folks turned to the wild patches of dandelions sprouting up around their homes. Those greens were packed with vitamins and free, which made them priceless in tough times. You foraged the leaves, gave them a good wash, and tossed them with hot bacon drippings for flavor. Sometimes you added a sprinkle of vinegar or chopped onions, but even plain, it was a meal that kept folks fed when options ran thin. This salad was scribbled down in those old community cookbooks and passed along like gold by families who knew the value of stretching every scrap. It was not fancy, but it brought a bite of freshness to plates often filled with starches and leftovers. Dandelion salad reminded folks that survival did not always come from the store. Sometimes it sprouted right outside your front door. Tomato soup with grilled cheese croutons was a simple yet satisfying meal that offered both warmth and substance for families on a budget. The basic tomato soup was typically made from canned tomatoes, broth, and seasonings, simmered to create a smooth, flavorful base. To add texture and a filling element, small grilled cheese sandwiches were cut into bite-sized croutons and floated atop the soup. This clever pairing stretched limited ingredients into a wholesome dish that children and adults could enjoy alike. The crispy, buttery bread combined with melted cheese complemented the tangy soup, providing contrasting flavors and textures in each bite. Tomato soup with grilled cheese croutons was easy to prepare in large pots, perfect for feeding families during cold months. Its affordability and comforting taste made it a beloved staple in many homes during the 1960s through the 1980s. The dish remains a nostalgic reminder of simple meals that nourished both body and soul. Elvis Presley wasn't the only one who loved a peanut butter and bacon sandwich. The combo of crispy, salty bacon and creamy, rich peanut butter created a high-protein, energy-packed sandwich that was a favorite for anyone in need of a quick and filling meal. It's easy to see why this sandwich caught on. It balanced savory and sweet, crunchy and creamy. The bacon gave it that satisfying crunch, while the peanut butter added a smooth richness. It wasn't the healthiest option, but when you're working with a tight budget and even tighter food supplies, it was a treat that gave you the energy to keep going. Not only was this a cheap meal, but it was also indulgent in a way that made you forget about how hard times really were. The combination of these two ingredients might have seemed strange, but it worked, and it worked well. But if you're craving something a little lighter, something that came before the age of bacon and peanut butter, the next sandwich on our list might be just what you need. Eggless depression. Cake with vinegar was one of those desserts that proved how far ingenuity could stretch when money ran out. With eggs, milk, and butter often too expensive or rationed, families still wanted a treat. Something sweet to lift the mood after hard days. Enter the vinegar cake. It sounds odd, but the vinegar reacted with baking soda to create a surprisingly fluffy, moist crumb without the need for eggs or dairy. You mixed simple pantry staples like flour, sugar, cocoa powder if you had it, and a splash of vinegar to make the batter. The result? A rich, chocolatey cake that showed up in community cookbooks and neighbor-to-neighbor recipes all across the country. Some folks called it wacky cake, others just called it survival baking. But it got the job done. You might not have frosting or fancy ingredients, but a warm slice of depression cake was enough to bring a little joy to the dinner table. In tough times, that simple, sweet bite meant more than anyone cared to admit. Cornbread and milk was a straightforward comfort food often eaten for breakfast or as a snack in families with limited means. Warm cornbread made from simple ingredients like cornmeal, water, and sometimes eggs or milk was sliced or broken into pieces and soaked in cold milk. This practice turned dry bread into a soft, nourishing dish that was both filling and affordable. Cornbread and milk provided an inexpensive source of calories and protein, making it a practical choice for those managing tight food budgets. Its warmth and familiarity brought comfort during difficult times, and it was commonly enjoyed in rural and urban homes alike. The simplicity of the dish allowed it to become a staple in the diets of many children growing up with little. The soothing texture and mild sweetness made it a favorite way to start the day or satisfy hunger between meals. Cornbread and milk symbolize the resilience and modest pleasures found in everyday sustenance. Cabbage and noodles, also known as haluski in some old neighborhoods, was a dish that filled plates and stomachs with almost nothing. It was a simple mix of butter-fried cabbage and boiled egg noodles, seasoned with salt, pepper, and maybe a little onion if you had it. That was it. But it stretched food farther than you would believe. Families leaned on this recipe when meat was scarce and grocery money ran out, and you would find it scribbled in Eastern European cookbooks or passed around mining towns and factory communities across the Rust Belt and Appalachia. It filled the kitchen with a warm, buttery smell, and it filled bellies with carbs and comfort. Some folks added bacon bits when they had extra. Others just kept it plain, but either way, this meal stuck to your ribs and made the hard days a little easier. It was never about flair. It was about feeding your family with dignity and scraping by on what you had. Cabbage and noodles proved you could eat well, even when your wallet said otherwise. Oatmeal with brown sugar was a hearty and affordable breakfast choice that kept families nourished and ready for the day. Simple rolled or quick oats were cooked in water or milk, then sweetened with brown sugar or molasses for extra flavor and calories. This warming dish provided fiber, energy, and comfort, making it a staple in homes facing financial hardship. Oatmeal was easy to prepare in large quantities and could be varied with additions like raisins or cinnamon when available. Its affordability and nutritional value made it a go-to breakfast across diverse American households during the 1960s to 1980s. For many, oatmeal with brown sugar is a nostalgic taste of early mornings when families gathered before work and school. The simplicity and warmth of this meal embody the practical and loving care present in homes stretching every resource. Stewed tomatoes over rice was poor man food that turned two basic staples into dinner when nothing else was left. You opened a can of tomatoes, or stewed your own if your garden was generous, and poured them over plain boiled rice. That was it. Maybe a pinch of salt, pepper, or a splash of vinegar if you had it, but most families kept it plain and simple. The tomatoes added moisture, acidity, and enough flavor to make a bowl of plain rice feel like a meal. This dish was a Depression-era favorite because it used pantry ingredients that were cheap, easy to store, and stretched to feed big families. It popped up in countless old cookbooks and neighborly recipe swaps, quietly keeping folks full during the hardest years. It was humble, maybe even a little sad by today's standards, but when hunger was real and money was tight, stewed tomatoes over rice was more than food. It was peace of mind, one spoonful at a time. Which of these forgotten one-income meals would you bring back to your table? Drop it in the comments, hit like, and subscribe for more meals your grandparents never wrote down.